Fandom kind of sucks now. However, it sucks a little bit less after the absolute explosion of heated rivalry. I know, I'm a little late to the party, it being April and
It's June.
What?
It's June.
It's June. Well, it's been a rough few months, but I'm here, back, making videos. Happy Pride! People from all walks of life are enjoying heated rivalry. It's being talked about in the news. It's all over TikTok. It's in my real life. Recently, I just went to a heated rivalry rave. In person. I feel like I have to emphasize that. Heated rivalry is an international sensation. It honestly reminds me of when TV was still on a weekly release schedule. There was a magic to the togetherness. We felt magic I haven't felt in a while because over the last decade and a half, I've grown steadily less enthusiastic about fandom, to be honest. In high school, I fell off of anime despite basically being raised on it because I grew tired of how poorly women were written, and I just haven't felt as strong of a spark for fandom since. Learning about misogyny, it turns out, for the first time really hits like nothing else. Heated rivalry, however, has reignited my passion for fandom and the discourse happening within that fandom. By the way, if you're new here, hi, my name is Esper, and I talk about things to a depth nobody asked for, and I want to talk about some of the forces pushing fandom to fail and the ways heated rivalry is counteracting those forces. Of course, there's a lot of reasons that's out of the scope of this video as to why this is happening, but the end result is the same. Fandom is crumbling and collapsing, and the first horseman of this apocalypse is the "it's not that deep" crowd. The absolute lifeless joy suckers of fandom spaces. We'll call them the not that deepers. I have the lukewarm take of the not that deepers don't actually like the things they think they're in fandom of. It's just that their consumption makes them think they're a part of something. But here's the thing. To be a part of something, you have to participate. And heated rivalry prompts you for participation, and I know nobody will be surprised that I have spent hours talking about it, but it's also the same for people around me. Discourse is happening. People are excited. They want to talk about heated rivalry, and more than that, they want to create things around heated rivalry. Knitted blankets, clay figures, clever videos, fan fiction, analysis, the list goes on. And that level of enthusiasm is a good enough counter to the suffocating forces of the people who think they're in fandom when really they are the dead weight keeping fandom from flourishing. Speaking of creating, I have a Patreon where you can get a 7-day free trial and listen to my full 6-episode podcast on heated rivalry, where I talk about some of my thoughts and analysis on the show. Here's a preview.
Ilya is known as somebody who is able to have a very casual relationship with sex, right? However, okay, maybe Shane believes that he has a very casual relationship with sex. He does not. As I have always said and always will say, these two have no idea what casual is. Episode 1 is free with or without a free trial. Just follow the link on screen.
On the surface, the not that deepers seem to just want to have fun. However, there is a darker underbelly of anti-intellectualism that is at play here. The not that deepers really have this vehement opposition that anything they consume might be reflective of something in the real world. That the stories they consume might have real world commentary, intentionally or unintentionally. I've had a lifetime's worth of insane comments from the not that deepers, and I feel like I can distill them into a few categories. Let's go to the whiteboard and let me explain this with a very convenient meme format. Let's talk about the phrase, "it's not that deep," the weaponized mantra of the not that deepers, okay? At first, the assumptions that you would have about this, that they rely on, is the broke take that this is just anti-intellectualism. At first, it would seem that it's not that deep is just people that are being stupid, but it is far more sinister than that. We have to stop thinking about it's not that deep as just pure and simple anti-intellectualism. It is, but it's not just that, right? It is seemingly on the surface just a way for people to be unwilling to learn new things, to disrupt communication between people, or just to not participate in the discussion but take up space in the places where discussion is happening. Those are all true. Don't get me wrong. However, it is meant to dismiss any and all critical thinking. It is also meant to stop joy, and it's meant to stop creativity. And that's really the point that we should focus on when people are saying it's not that deep. Heated rivalry, at its core, is something that is inherently creative and very, very deep. If you wanted to talk about any of the things in heated rivalry, you could talk about the costuming. And here is the costumer talking about the decisions that she made.
My boards often reflect the time progression of the characters, if there's specific pieces that I want to showcase or a specific vibe I want to showcase for different moments. This was what I did for Shane. Sidney Crosby was a real example of what I wanted to do with him. Like, suits, very straight cut, bit more American cut in style, very basic, nothing that's going to draw too much attention. And I think that really, to me, really speaks to the idea of Shane just wanting to be under the radar.
You can talk about the intimacy coordinator. Here are some clips of the intimacy coordinator talking about the intricacies of the scenes in heated rivalry.
The choreography is often like down to like an inch of like a hip placement or a hand placement in order to like be masking modesty garments to work with the angle of the camera, so that all of the simulation that you're seeing, because it's all simulated sex, can feel realistic to the viewer. And that takes so much preparation, so many conversations.
And you can do so much more. People have talked about the cinematography, the choice of the cameras, the way that it was filmed. There are so many things in heated rivalry that not only the community has talked about, but people who have worked on heated rivalry have talked about. Heated rivalry counteracts this on the very fact that the creativity and the depth of heated rivalry cannot be stopped by simply saying it's not that deep. Because if you say it, you just look kind of stupid. And that's going to be a theme as we go along in all of these takes. And here's the woke take. Saying it's not that deep is actually aggression, because as we talked about here, stopping creativity and stopping critical thinking is aggression. It is meant to discourage people from voicing their own opinions. It's meant to put people on the defensive, because if somebody starts off the conversation with it's not that deep, you're immediately working from the deficit of it's not that deep. You're immediately working from a negative viewpoint rather than taking it and celebrating the joy of something that was created, right? So this it's not that deep is actually an aggression by the people who say it. The not that deepers are being aggressive toward the people who actually want to participate in fandom. They don't want you to enjoy anything, because for them, your enjoyment, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk a little bit more about this. Ultimately, what this is doing as an aggression is trying to cement the status quo, right? Like, if you are trying to make people think it's not that deep, that is the inherent baseline that you think should be proliferated out there. And so much so that you're willing to comment it all over the goddamn place. It's also meant to discredit the people that are saying deeper and more creative things, because it puts them again in that defensive position. It's not that deep, as you may have noticed by now, is stopping creative, critical, and thoughtful thinking. And it's meant to not only be an aggression toward the creators, it's also meant to be an aggression toward the fandom. These people are not a part of the fandom. People who behave like this can never be part of the fandom. And heated rivalry actually inoculates itself to things like this. It inoculates itself to the aggression of the it's not that deepers. And it does this by being extremely honest about what it is. Heated rivalry is the gay hockey show. And there is no mistaking that that is what heated rivalry is, because we don't even get 15 minutes into the show until we have our first sex. Heated Rivalry does the work of gatekeeping from this aggression because of the way that it presents itself. Heated Rivalry is honest. Heated Rivalry does not bend its rules around what is expected of it. I don't want to say it's aggressive back, but it is certainly very much standing its ground in the face of aggression, of trying to maintain a certain status quo within the presentation of the media that we see. Now, buckle in for this one because we're going to get a little bit deep. We're getting a little bit deep, okay? Bespoke. They view invitations for self-reflection as aggression. We've talked about how saying it's not that deep is actually an aggression to the creators, to the people that are actually in fandom. But the reason why they do this, the reason why there is even this aggression in the first place, is because any sort of self-reflection for these people are looked at as aggression. Any invitation that something has to be self-reflective is viewed by them as an aggression, because a lot of the people, and we're going to make a leap here, but I need you to stay with me. I think a lot of the people that are not that deepers are people who outsource their personalities to what things they consume. And this isn't even limited to media. It could be things that you buy, even places you hang out in. It could be anything except for the thing that is really inside you. We're getting a little bit deep here, but stay with me. I think that the capitalistic nature of our world rewards consumption as self-reflection, even when it's not. And when people create things that are that deep, that are saying more things, deeper things, sometimes painful and like really, really uncomfortable things about the things we consume, people can view that as an aggression toward them because they see themselves as an extension of the media that they consume. Ultimately, this is vulnerability, and they don't want to be vulnerable because they have substituted consumption for vulnerability. And how Heated Rivalry counteracts this disdain for vulnerability is that Heated Rivalry as a show makes you watch two people bare their entire souls and bodies to the audience on this incredibly transformative journey that they go on. By definition, Heated Rivalry is utmost vulnerability. Heated Rivalry is the journey of two people who are very much going through their queer awakening. If that's not vulnerability, then I have no idea what is. The process of realizing this about yourself, as is shown in the show, is a process that is incredibly not only vulnerable, but at times painful, because you have to shed parts of who you are. And as such, Heated Rivalry attracts people who are not disdainful to vulnerability, and it really shields itself from people who think that it's not that deep. Heated Rivalry really encourage you to bring your own stories to this show. So much of the things that are talked about and shown in Heated Rivalry can be applied to real people's lives. And there's actually this fantastic TikTok by a Glitch Gestalt Girl that we're going to watch right now.
Can a Canadian gay hockey show help people process trauma better than years of therapy? In my particular case, I can say with 100% certainty, yes, absolutely. And from what I've seen in my comments and posts from other people, I know that I'm not alone in this experience. And I believe that those of us that have experienced PTSD or CPTSD, what we experienced with this show was a collective, corrective emotional experience. When I watched Heated Rivalry for the first time, my initial response to it was an intense, profound grief. And I've only had that experience one other time when I was directing a scene in one of my shorts that was based directly off of a moment in my life. But that's a story for another video if you want to hear it. When I had this intense grief experience with Heated Rivalry, I found myself rewatching the show over and over for the next several days until that feeling of grief finally lifted. And ever since then, I have felt emotionally lighter, like a weight is just gone. I'd been trying to figure out what exactly just happened to me, until I saw a therapist talking about corrective emotional experiences.
In that TikTok, she talks about corrective emotional experiences, which is essentially it's a psychological term. Let me actually just read it. Corrective emotional experiences is basically the process of re-experiencing trauma in a safe environment to reach catharsis. A different reaction to the same scenario essentially helps rewrite the narrative. So we're going to look at this diagram. I'm just going to put it on the screen. Notice how emotion has a double arrow. Behavior corrects emotion, and emotion corrects behavior. And you can correct emotions through cognition or thinking about it, which is why it doesn't surprise me that Heated Rivalry has prompted these corrective emotional experiences. I'll read you one of the comments about other people who have had this experience. This one says, even 2 months later, I still struggle to put to words what happened to me. I've been suffering from severe depression for 5 years, unable to work. At the end of episode 5, I felt, even heard my brain and heart pop. I've felt completely different ever since. Yeah, it is that deep. That should be all the evidence you need to see how Heated Rivalry is counteracting Not That Deepers. And it really also just shows how misfit Not That Deepers would be in the Heated Rivalry fandom. Because imagine thinking that something as vulnerable and as real and raw as Heated Rivalry is not that deep. Heated Rivalry says it is that deep, and as such brings an avenue for fandom to flourish. And while I'm a big death of the author guy, I do think in this case it is nice that Jacob outright says, yeah, it is that deep, because it makes my life easier when I can just point and go, Jacob said so. And one of the things Jacob has said definitively is the sex in Heated Rivalry is an integral part of what it is. Here he is talking about it.
This specific story with Shane and Ilya and Heated Rivalry, sex is the language with which these two characters communicate for so many years. They don't really talk to each other. They have sex. And the scenes are not gratuitous, or at least I don't think they're gratuitous. They're there to tell the story. They're a function of the story. They're part of the story. And it was also really important to see how they changed and evolved with this relationship.
I didn't need him to tell me, but some people did. The word gratuitous has been thrown around, but I feel like that is a puritanical viewpoint leaching out into the mainstream, which brings us to the second horseman of our fandom apocalypse, the Puritans. Jacob talks about sex and Heated Rivalry and how it is integral to the story. Sex has been a normal part of the human experience for so long as we have been alive. I can confidently say this because if no one had sex, we would stop existing. It's pretty easily verifiable. But somehow, sex is one of the most taboo topics to ever exist, so much so that it is an immense target for censorship. And the problem with censorship is that it often targets groups that are already marginalized, like queer people and people of color. They start with small things that everyone hates and then uses that as a gateway to get to those people, to slippery slope to banning things that are slightly adjacent, and then the thing after that, and so it goes on till we're back to having Hays Code again. We're not even going to talk about the extremes of Puritan belief, because extremes, no matter what they would have you believe, are outliers that you will rarely ever encounter in your life. We're going to talk about the milquetoast middle ground, a thing that you will probably encounter more often. Problematic culture and its inability to hold nuance, especially around sex. There are a lot of topics they really can't hold nuance on, actually pretty much all of them.
Inevitably, whenever I make a video, I end up with a spot where I realize I didn't actually say what I was supposed to, but I'm not going to get in makeup and dress up again, so you're just going to have to look at me like this. The reason why purity culture is bad for fandom is because of the way that it looks for absolutes. And it looks for absolute good and absolute bad, which that's not the way that humans work. But to look for absolute good and absolute bad, there needs to be a list of good things and bad things. And the list of good things and bad things can never change. Their inability to hold nuance inevitably makes things punishable despite their context. Fandom has always been like this. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Back in Tumblr, let me tell you, people are still having these arguments. However, the thing that is exacerbating purity culture right now is the panopticon of social media. Panopticon is this like trendy buzzword right now that people are using to describe social media, but it's kind of true. I'm not really going to get into it because, you know, I haven't really fully formed my thoughts on it, and also this video is long enough as it is. Social media does function a little bit like this ever-present thing in our lives, and you know, there are people out there like filming strangers and then posting it on the internet. Even if you are not on social media, there is a chance that you feel like you can't even get away from social media. So there is this inevitable feeling of being watched constantly that is being coincided with purity culture, and I think it is giving people this feeling that they have to act in certain ways that are pure good so that they are not perceived in an unfavorable way. And the reason why purity culture is so bad for in general, but also for fandom, is that it doesn't leave room for humanity. We all have messed up at some point in our lives, and we will all mess up again at some point in our lives. To be human is to be in flux, and purity culture and its rigidity does not leave room for the flux that humanity requires to be creative and to be a person who participates in fandom, to be somebody who is passionate. The combination of purity culture and the panopticon gives people a lot of pause to even doing anything. And if you feel that way, you're not bound to do anything that you think might even get you in a little bit of trouble. And that's it. That's, you know, the whole point. I'm going to tell you about the Hays Code now.
Let's go back to the Hays Code. If you don't know what the Hays Code is, it's censorship that determined what was allowed to be shown on screen and what wasn't. We're reading straight from Wikipedia here.
The code was divided into two parts. The first was a set of general principles, which prohibited a picture from lowering the moral standards of those who see it, so as not to wrongly influence a specific audience of viewers, including women, children, lower class, or those of susceptible minds. Called for depictions of the correct standards of life, and lastly, forbade a picture to show any sort of ridicule towards a law or creating sympathy for its violation. The second part was a set of particular applications, which was an exacting list of items that could not be depicted. Some restrictions, such as the ban on homosexuality or on the use of specific curse words, were never directly mentioned, but were assumed to be understood without clear demarcation. Homosexuals were de facto included under the prescription of sex perversion, and the depiction of miscegenation, by 1934 defined only as sexual relationships between black and white races, was forbidden.
Now let's break this down. The idea that fiction affects people negatively seems to originate from the fact that women, children, and the lower class were of susceptible minds. And this whole idea of fiction corrupting the minds of people were rooted in the idea that women and the lower class were equated to having the same faculties as a child. Notice how rich, white men aren't included in that list of susceptible minds. I'm not denying fiction's ability to influence people. We literally just talked about corrective emotional experiences, but the route to that influence is far more nonlinear than people would think. A lot of the ways we interpret the world is through our lived experiences first and foremost. There is research to back this up. It's called the predictive brain theory. Without metacognition or thinking about why we think things, we are susceptible to just keep letting what we have already experienced decide how we see the world. But problematic culture seeks to create this narrative that representation of certain things in the media corrupts absolutely, which is really more of an attack toward at-risk groups than the protection they think it is. I'm not really here to argue how fiction affects people, but rather highlight that how you think about what is presented to you is more important than what it is you consume. Therefore, to begin the process of critical thinking, one must make choices for themselves because no body of censorship will ever be trustworthy enough. Notice how homosexuality was de facto included in the sexual perversion category. Heated Rivalry, being a same-sex love story, would not have been allowed under the auspices of the Hays Code, but even when same-sex relationships and love stories began being depicted, there was this sense of punishment that came about with our storytelling that it must end in suffering. So much so that it created the bury your gays trope. Jacob Tierney talks about the subconscious expectation for a bad ending in an interview.
On the sex, there is a lot of optimism in this story. There's a lot of beauty in this story. There is not much dread. You know, my wife and I were watching it, and she kept saying to me, something bad's going to happen, and she was dreading that. That doesn't happen, at least not in the first season.
No, it doesn't happen. And it's very interesting that you say that, because a lot of gay audiences, a lot of queer audiences, a lot of people just a little bit older than me, but I think also my age, we are used to something bad happening. We are used to waiting for the other shoe to drop. We're used to a punishment, especially if we get to have sex. If you see sex in queer sex in mainstream content, there is almost always a punishment later on narratively. And this show does not have that. It is truly, that's why I wanted to make it. It is a celebration of queer joy.
Here, the interviewer's wife had this feeling that something bad is going to happen. And I felt this too. There were so many times I felt like the characters were going to be punished. It is the expectation that being queer must have a punishment because of the way society had made people experience queerness. But this is the very thought that Jacob decides to go against. This also highlights the point I made earlier about how lived experiences are the stronger force in one's engagement with the stories they consume. It's why I do a lot of feminist analysis. To bring us full circle back to our predictive brain theory, it is reality that shapes those narratives and not the other way around. But it is the metacognition to recognize where those patterns come from that we can use to break the cycle. This is what happened with the people who had corrective emotional experiences with heated rivalry. To create joyous queer stories, we must then extend our view and experience of being queer as joyous. And yes, that means every part of it, sex included. I then want to extend this metaphor to fandom spaces. There is so much about fandom space that is meant to be about creativity and joy, and a lot of it has now turned into, I don't want to say narcissistic supply, but to borrow from that, moral high ground superiority supply. While that doesn't quite roll off the tongue as well, heated rivalry is counteracting this plague in fandom spaces. The currency in which fandom operates have strayed away from joy and creativity to, frankly, what gets views on social media. Rage bait, anger, moral superiority. The not so secret third horseman of this video is the algorithmic nature of the content that fandom consumes now. A lot of people hold the sentiment that 2020 rise of fandom is the cause of a lot of the downfall. And that's partly true, because a lot of fandom was revived in algorithmic spaces like TikTok and YouTube because of the lack of physical spaces during the pandemic. I already did a video on this, and it will be in the description and at the end of this video if you want to watch it. But the general gist of it is that anger is a very powerful motivator, which is why so much of the content that proliferates out tend to have extreme or inflammatory takes. But the algorithm isn't looking for rage, it's just looking for engagement, which heightened emotion provides. The heightened emotion that heated rivalry taps into, though, is joy, which is far more difficult to tap into than rage. I think this is why so much of the content I've seen of heated rivalry has been positive, creative, and joyful because of the way that it has touched fandom spaces in a positive way, which is the opposite of the way that Puritans exist, because they all seem to want to be miserable. They all want everyone to be miserable, which brings us back to the whiteboard, because I want to talk more about the underlying beliefs about this and how heated rivalry counteracts it. Let's talk about nuance. So how does heated rivalry counteract purity culture? Well, at its core, purity culture seems to have this very good message of bad things shouldn't exist. That seems simple enough, right? Bad things shouldn't exist. I think everybody can get behind that, but that's really the issue with the messaging of puritanical culture, is who gets to decide what the bad thing is, right? Because underlying this entire idea, right? Underlying that is simply control. When you start saying what things shouldn't and shouldn't exist, ultimately it comes down to a question not of what, but of who gets to decide what that thing is, what the bad things are. We go back and look at the Hays Code. People back then decided that homosexuality was a bad thing, so much so that it didn't even need specification for it to be considered a bad thing. It was just understood. That's pretty fucked up, isn't it? And to this day still, it is still targeting marginalized people every single day. Because at the very core of it, control is simply just power. That's barely legible, but you're going to have to live with it. And the reason why it's important to have the discussion that control is simply power is because there is something that gets lost when power is brought into the conversation. And that is control and power lacks nuance. There is no nuance when you are desiring power. And to have control, you need power. We're going around in circles here. You get what I'm trying to say. To remove this lack of nuance, to create nuance, you need to be able to educate people. Because when there is nuance, there is no absolute power. There is no control because each and every single situation requires thought to get through, right? Nuance brings about a desire for education, a desire for a world that reflects the depth of the education that people are receiving. And ultimately, when people want to make the decision for you, they don't want nuance, they don't want education, they don't want agency. All they want is for you to just accept the things that they are saying. They want power because power can only be built off 100% certainty. When you begin to educate people and thus give them agency, and they demand a world that reflects that education and that agency ultimately loses people power. And this is why nuance is important. This is why the puritanical way of doing things, this is the reason why saying that certain things just simply shouldn't exist will never and should never be the solution for these things, because people should instead be given the tools to help them think their way into the actual solution that is appropriate. Banning things, saying that things shouldn't exist, is just one leg of the slippery slope of thinking that keeping people from consuming certain media is going to keep them from turning into something that society doesn't like. If we go back, all the way back to what we were talking about with the Not That Deepers, it keeps the status quo, and it is a rigid hold on that status quo. But Heated Rivalry does something opposite. Heated Rivalry treats its audience like it has agency, like they're educated, like they are paying attention. And it really shakes up this idea that things must be a certain way for them to be appropriate, for them to be meaningful, for them to exist. And that's at the core of it. Nobody else gets to decide what exists or not. The onus is on the person to make sure that they are interacting with the things that exist in a way where they are thinking and where they are making their own conclusions as to what that thing means. And ultimately, you can come to the decision that that thing is bad. Nobody is stopping you, by the way, from doing that. Nobody is saying that something cannot be bad and that something shouldn't be consumed by you. But when it starts to reach out to other people and people start saying, you shouldn't consume it, I think that is then when we need to be more critical, because we need to start thinking about what that control brings them, what being able to say no and what being able to keep you from consuming those things gives them. And it's always ultimately power. But again, in Heated Rivalry, you don't really get this because you have an audience full of people who are being treated as if they have agency, as if they are engaged with this content. The thing that Heated Rivalry does really well is that it treats its audience like they're smart and they're paying attention. And people rose up to that invitation enthusiastically because it feels good to be seen in that way. Heated rivalry encourages you to find deeper meaning. In the day and age of competition to make the best background noise, heated rivalry says, no, you will glue your eyes to TV by your own volition because you won't be able to look away. Because there are so many things to uncover in each scene, and the sex and physicality is just as important as the dialogue. It is a storytelling tool, and you are rewarded for noticing it. You see this in so many ways. There was a Tumblr user that pointed out in the bathroom scene, while Ilya is holding Shane, he nudges Shane's head into the crook of his neck. It is such subtle yet impactful acting post 6 months of ghosting after their first time. In the preceding moments of their second biggest car crash moment, only second to negate, Ilya still shows tenderness to Shane because he is in love with him, and his denial is not stronger than his love. He literally cannot help himself. One of the directions that Jacob gave Connor and Hudson was that if they were in a scene together and they weren't touching, that requires so much effort.
But what you remember, what grounds you is the other person, that your love is what grounds you. And then the other thing that I said to them a lot was, whenever you guys are in a scene together and you're not touching, that requires so much effort. I want to feel the idea that you want to be next to the other person. You want to be in physical contact with them, and you're not.
Brings us moments like their shoes touching during the All-Star Game interviews, the beach scene in episode 5, and it's even present at the beginning of episode 1 when Shane's foot twitches toward Ilya in the gym scene. It is that deep, and heated rivalry rewards you for paying attention, for engaging with the story in a truly meaningful way. I say that with the utmost praise because it helps people have a stepping stone with which to begin to think about sex and physicality and all of its complexities. It's also rather impossible to take in bad faith because attempts to do so will kind of just make you look stupid. There have been criticisms around how Shane and Ilya's relationship was kind of just a toxic situationship, but the story kind of handholds you through episodes 4 to 6 as to why that is, why living as a closeted queer man, very visible to the public eye, makes your life harder, why feelings are so complex, why the denial is there, and all of that is directly put there by Jacob because it was put there by Rachel. Ultimately, though, while this is a good starting point, it also touches at the crux of the issue with puritanical thinking. They're always looking to outsource the rights and wrongs to a higher power instead of interpreting the nuance in every situation. But hey, we all need to start somewhere, and if there are people out there whose starting points need to be Jacob saying it directly into the camera and breaking the fourth wall, then so be it. To save fandom, people have to start thinking for themselves somewhere. The fourth horseman was me all along, asking you to subscribe and tell your friends about me. And if you want to learn more about how the algorithm harms the overall creative ecosystem and why I ask you to share my videos via word of mouth instead of just relying on the algorithm, click on the video on screen now. I'll see you in that video. Bye.